In the center of the galaxy there was a hall so large that even the skies of Earth could not compare. The Galactic Council had gathered there, thousands of alien leaders from countless worlds. Their bodies were strange, some with shining scales, some with wings, some with glowing eyes that never blinked. They all sat in silence waiting for one small figure to enter. That figure was not a warrior or a scientist or a ruler. It was a human child. The guards opened the heavy doors and the sound echoed across the chamber. The child walked slowly down the long floor that glowed with silver light. Every alien eye turned to watch. The beings expected fear. They expected the human child to cry or shake or hide. Instead, the child walked forward without hesitation. The head barely reached the knees of the smaller aliens, yet there was no weakness in the step. The High Chancellor, tallest among them, stood and raised a long arm. His voice rumbled across the chamber. He spoke of Earth, a world still young, a world not ready to join the great circle of advanced species. He reminded the Council that humans had not mastered peace, that they were reckless, violent, and unworthy of power. Then he declared that a test would be given. The future of Earth would rest on the actions of this one child. If the child failed, the humans would lose their voice forever among the stars. The words were meant to frighten. Many aliens smiled cruelly, waiting for the human to collapse under the pressure. But the child did not collapse. The child listened with calm eyes and then looked up at the High Chancellor. There was no trembling voice, no desperate plea. Only a quiet smile that spread across a young face. This moment disturbed the Council. These were beings who had seen wars, who had crushed rebellions, who had ruled planets for ages. They were used to fear. Yet from this small human there was none. The silence in the hall grew heavy. Some aliens whispered to each other, unable to hide their unease. The first test would begin soon. The Council wanted to break the human spirit. They wanted to prove that Earth was still nothing but a wild planet with no place in the order of the galaxy. But the child's calmness already planted a shadow of doubt. As the child stood waiting, the hall shimmered with hidden machines. Walls of light rose around the floor, forming a circle. Strange patterns glowed and shifted in the air. This was the beginning of the first challenge, a puzzle of impossible design. The child tilted the head slightly, watching, not with fear but with curiosity. The High Chancellor watched from above, his golden eyes narrowing. Every being in the Council remembered the words spoken before the test. If the human failed, Earth would lose its voice. If the human passed, Earth would still be dangerous. Many of them did not want to admit that humans had even the smallest chance. To them, humanity was still a primitive species, a people of chaos and war. But now they watched something they had never expected. The child looked small in the silver circle but stood with a strange kind of strength. Not the strength of muscles, not the strength of weapons, but the strength of quiet confidence. For the first time in many years the great hall felt uncertain. A voice rose from the far side, sharp and mocking. An insect-like leader clicked its jaws and asked why the Council wasted time on such a weak being. Others joined, laughing, certain the child would fail within moments. Yet others remained silent, watching more carefully. They saw something different in the way the child's eyes moved, scanning the glowing puzzles, noticing details most would ignore. The High Chancellor raised his hand again and the voices stopped. He declared the first challenge open. The child had to solve what no other young being had ever solved. If the child failed, the sentence was final. If the child tried to escape, the machines would strike. There was no mercy in this test. Still, the child only nodded once, as if accepting the rules of a game. That simple nod echoed louder than any speech. The aliens leaned forward on their seats. Some laughed softly, waiting for failure. Some frowned, uneasy without knowing why. The chamber lights dimmed and the puzzles grew brighter. Strange shapes twisted in the air, glowing lines formed mazes and patterns without end. The sound of the machines filled the silence. The child took one step forward into the heart of the glowing challenge. The hall held its breath. Thousands of alien leaders stared, waiting to see weakness. Instead, they saw the small figure standing tall under the silver light. They saw a child who did not bow, who did not break, who did not fear the Council or the tests. At that moment, a whisper spread through the crowd. It began with one alien and then another until many were murmuring the same thought. If a human child could stand without fear before the greatest powers of the galaxy, what else could humanity do? The High Chancellor heard the whispers and his golden eyes darkened. He slammed his staff on the floor and the sound cracked like thunder. The murmurs stopped at once. He stared down at the child and declared the words that would decide everything. The first puzzle begins now. The silver lights shifted into 1,000 moving patterns. The air vibrated with strange energy. The challenge had started. The fate of Earth now rested in the hands of one small human child. And as the first shapes twisted into impossible designs, the child only smiled again. The circle of silver light closed around the human child. Strange patterns moved through the air like rivers of fire and glass. These were puzzles created by the most advanced minds of the galaxy. They were meant to break thought, to twist reason, to crush hope. No young being had ever solved them. Even older alien scholars often failed. The High Chancellor believed the human would fall within seconds. The first puzzle appeared. Lines of light formed shapes that changed every moment. A tower, a spiral, a storm of endless paths. To the council it looked like pure chaos. The child stood still, eyes following the lines, head tilting slightly. There was no panic. Only quiet focus. An insect-like leader hissed with laughter. It told the others the human was frozen, too slow, too simple. The hall filled with mocking voices. But then the child raised one hand and traced a single line in the air. At once the shapes froze. The child had found a pattern. With one step forward the chaos unlocked and the first puzzle collapsed into nothing. The hall went silent. Aliens who had mocked now stared with wide eyes. The child had solved it in less than a minute. The next puzzle rose immediately. This one was harder. The air filled with numbers, symbols from a dozen different alien languages. They shifted, mixed, and repeated without order. The puzzle was designed to exhaust the mind. Yet the child did not look confused. The child squinted at the lights, then smiled. Instead of chasing the numbers like others did, the child noticed small mistakes in the design. One symbol repeated where it should not. One number was out of place. The child touched those flaws one by one and the puzzle collapsed again. Gasps echoed across the chamber. The insect leader stopped laughing. A reptilian ruler with golden scales leaned forward and whispered that this was not possible. The puzzles had been tested by machines far older than human civilization. And yet the child was breaking them one after another. The High Chancellor's golden eyes narrowed. He spoke with anger, demanding the next puzzle begin. The machines obeyed and the floor shook with power. This time the challenge was even more cruel. The puzzle grew into a labyrinth of light that twisted into the ceiling and down into the floor. It was not only a puzzle but a trap. Step the wrong way and the walls would close with burning energy. The child stepped inside without fear. The walls shifted and blocked every path. Most would have rushed, would have tried to outrun the moving barriers. But the child stood still and watched. Slowly the pattern revealed itself. The walls moved in rhythm like a song. The child stepped forward only when the rhythm opened. Step by step the child walked through the impossible labyrinth. The council was silent now. No laughter, no mocking. Only the sound of the walls moving and the quiet steps of the human child. Finally the child reached the center. A final wall closed in from all sides. There was no path left. The trap was complete. The aliens leaned forward, believing at last the human would fail. But the child crouched down and touched the floor. Where everyone else had seen only walls, the child noticed a small gap at the ground. The child lay flat and slid under the burning wall. In seconds the child stood free at the end of the labyrinth. For a moment there was only silence. Then voices burst across the hall. Some shouted that the test was broken. Some shouted that the child cheated. Others cried out that this was proof. The council divided in chaos. The High Chancellor struck his staff again and the sound roared like thunder. The hall fell silent at once. His voice was filled with anger but also with something else, something colder. Fear. He had seen what the child had done and he could not deny it. The puzzles were created to measure logic, patience, and perception. They were designed so that even the greatest alien minds struggled. But this small human had solved them not with great power, not with endless knowledge, but with something different. The child had looked for mistakes, for simple truths hidden under complex designs. The child looked up at the High Chancellor and finally spoke. The voice was calm, steady, almost soft, but it carried across the hall. The child said, "You look for complex answers. Humans survive by finding the simple ones." The words struck harder than any puzzle. The council stirred again, shocked that such a small being dared to speak so directly. The High Chancellor glared down, his golden eyes burning. He ordered the machines to shut down. The puzzles ended, the lights faded, and the circle dissolved. The human child stepped back into the open floor, unharmed, unbroken, and still calm. The silence of the hall was heavy. Thousands of alien leaders who had come to watch a failure now looked at a possibility they could not explain. Whispers spread again, soft at first, then louder. Could this child be a sign of what humans truly were? Could it be that Earth was not weak but dangerous in a way no one had imagined? The High Chancellor raised his staff one more time. He announced that the first test was complete. Against every expectation the human child had passed. The next trial would not be of logic. It would be of courage. The guards turned and the floor of the hall began to shift, preparing the new challenge. The beasts of the simulation were waiting. And still the child only smiled. The floor of the grand hall shook as heavy machines moved below. Silver panels opened and the ground split apart. A new chamber rose from the depths, its walls high and dark. The council members leaned forward in their seats, curious and eager. This was the second trial. It was not about logic or puzzles. It was about fear. The High Chancellor declared the test. The human child would be placed inside a simulation created by the most advanced alien minds. Inside the simulation waited creatures born from the worst nightmares of many worlds. They were designed to terrify, to crush courage, and to break the will of anyone who faced them. The child would either face the beasts with bravery or collapse under the terror. If the child fell, Earth would lose all voice in the council. The machines glowed. A beam of light surrounded the human child. In a blink, the child vanished from the silver floor and appeared inside the simulation. The council could see everything projected above the chamber. They leaned closer, waiting for the moment when the human would scream. The child stood in a wasteland of black stone. The sky above was blood red, and the air was filled with the growl of distant beasts. Shadows moved at the edges, large shapes with glowing eyes. The ground trembled as something massive began to approach. The child did not run. Instead the child bent down, touched the black dust, and watched carefully. The first beast appeared, a towering monster with claws long as swords and a mouth filled with jagged teeth. Its roar shook the air. Most beings would have fallen to their knees in terror. But the child stepped to the side and picked up a broken stone. The beast charged, faster than a storm. The child threw the stone, not at the beast but at a weak column of rock. The rock cracked and fell, crashing down between the child and the monster. The beast roared again, trapped for a moment behind the broken stone. The council gasped. The child had not fought with strength. The child had used the world itself as a weapon. But the simulation was not finished. More shadows moved in the red sky. Two beasts leapt from above, wings stretched wide. Their bodies glowed with burning fire. They circled the child, preparing to strike. The child crouched low, eyes darting around the field. The beasts dove, their claws ready to shred. At the last second the child ran not away but toward the fire pits scattered on the ground. The beasts followed, but when the child stopped suddenly, the beasts collided with each other and fell into the burning pit. The hall filled with shocked voices. No one had ever passed the courage trial like this. Most beings tried to fight, most tried to endure the terror. The human child had not fought with fists or with weapons. The child had tricked the monsters, turned the world against them. The High Chancellor clenched his fists. His golden eyes narrowed as the next beast appeared in the simulation. This one was larger than all the rest, a nightmare of many species combined. It had the wings of a dragon, the fangs of a serpent, and the claws of a predator. Its roar shook the entire chamber even through the projection. The child stood still as the monster stepped forward. The ground cracked beneath its weight. The monster opened its mouth, a cavern of endless teeth. The council leaned closer, believing this would finally break the child. But instead of fear, the child whispered words. They were simple, unheard by the council, but they carried calmness. Then the child began to move, not running but walking in circles, slow and steady. The monster followed, confused by the strange movement. The child kept circling, faster and faster, drawing the monster in. At last the monster stepped on the weak stone the child had noticed earlier. The ground shattered, and the giant beast crashed into a deep chasm, roaring as it fell into the dark. The projection went silent. The simulation ended. The child stood alone in the wasteland, unharmed, breathing steady. Then the red sky dissolved and the beam of light returned. In the blink of an eye the child was back in the council hall, standing on the silver floor once again. The aliens stared in silence. The beasts were created to terrify, to overwhelm, to destroy courage. But the human child had faced them with strategy, not panic. The child had survived not by strength but by using the environment, by refusing to let fear control the mind. At last the High Chancellor spoke. His voice was low but carried across the hall. He declared that the trial of courage was complete. Against every expectation the human child had passed. The council broke into chaos. Some shouted that it was impossible, that the simulation had been tricked. Others whispered that perhaps humans were not as weak as they thought. A few even clapped their hands or clicked their jaws in respect. The High Chancellor silenced them with a strike of his staff. He glared down at the child with eyes burning like fire. He declared that the next trial would not be of logic or courage. The next trial would be of morality, the hardest test of all. The hall grew quiet again. The child stood in the silver light, small and calm, waiting. And when the High Chancellor said the words of the third challenge, the child only smiled. The silver floor shifted once more, and the great hall grew darker. The High Chancellor raised his staff and spoke with a heavy voice. He declared the third trial, the trial of morality. This test was not about puzzles or monsters. It was about choice. A choice that was meant to trap the human child, to expose selfishness, and to break hope. The machines of the council glowed again, and the child was lifted in a beam of light. The simulation opened above for all to see. The child found themselves standing on a platform in the middle of a wide abyss. On one side, there was a small cage holding a single alien child, weak and crying. On the other side, there was a large platform filled with many prisoners, dozens of different beings from across the stars. A voice filled the air, cold and heavy. The voice of the High Chancellor explained the rules. The human child had to choose. If the small cage was saved, the larger group would fall. If the larger group was saved, the small child would be lost forever. There was no third path. One must die. One must live. The council leaned forward. They had seen this test before. Every being tried to choose, but every being left the trial scarred, guilty, broken. This was not a test to be won. It was a trap meant to prove that no one could escape moral weakness. The human child looked from one side to the other. The small alien child cried out in fear. The larger group shouted for help, their voices desperate. The human stood still, eyes sharp, mind working. Minutes passed. The council waited for panic, for despair. But the child did not cry, did not collapse. Instead, the child whispered something under their breath. Then the child raised their head and shouted, "I do not accept your choice." The council gasped. The High Chancellor's golden eyes flared with anger. He repeated the rules, louder this time. One life or many. That was the only choice. The simulation tightened, the abyss shook, the cages began to break. Time was running out. But the child shook their head. They refused to obey. Instead of running toward one side or the other, the child dropped to the floor of the platform and searched. Their small hands felt along the surface, looking for something the council had hidden. The aliens watching began to murmur. They had never seen a challenger behave this way. At last, the child found it, a control node buried under the surface of the platform, a weak point in the simulation's design. The child struck it hard with their fist. Sparks burst, light flashed, and the cages above began to flicker. The council shouted in alarm. The simulation was not meant to be broken. It was meant only to force a choice. But the human child refused to accept the rules. They refused to believe in a no-win scenario. The child shouted again, louder this time, "There is always another way." The cages trembled. The small alien child's prison began to fall, but the human ran to the edge and pulled a lever hidden in the collapsing walls. At the same moment, the large platform tilted, threatening to drop the many prisoners into the abyss. The human child leapt, catching the last handle, forcing the machines to lock. The simulation shook violently, alarms rang, and then suddenly all cages released. Both the small child and the larger group were saved. The abyss closed. The simulation ended. The human child stood again in the silver hall, breathing hard but unbroken. The council exploded with voices. Some shouted in disbelief. Some accused the child of cheating. But others clapped, cheered, or stared with awe. For centuries, this test had only broken hearts. Yet this human child had refused to accept the rules themselves. They had found a path no one else had dared to look for. The High Chancellor stood silent, his staff shaking with fury. His golden eyes burned, but inside them there was also fear. He had designed this test to expose weakness, but instead it had revealed strength. The child looked up at him and spoke again, calm and steady. "You said I must choose who dies. I chose that no one dies. That is the human way." The words spread through the hall like fire. Thousands of aliens whispered to one another. Some laughed in disbelief. Some sat in silence, unable to argue. For the first time, many of them began to wonder if humans were far more dangerous and far more brilliant than they had believed. The High Chancellor struck his staff to silence the noise. His voice thundered as he declared that the third trial was complete. Against all expectation, the human child had passed. But he was not finished. He told the council that the next trial would not be about puzzles, beasts, or choices. It would be about words. A battle of truth, a test of voice, before the entire council. The hall fell into silence once more. The aliens turned their eyes toward the small human, waiting to see fear at last. But the child stood calm, eyes bright, and smiled. The hall of the Galactic Council was brighter now, lit by golden flames that floated high above the seats. Thousands of alien leaders leaned forward. The air was heavy with silence. The High Chancellor rose from his throne, his staff glowing with power. His voice thundered across the chamber. The human child has passed 3 trials. Logic. Courage. Morality. But trials are nothing without truth. The final judgment will be made here, in words, before the council. Let the human speak. Let the child prove why Earth deserves a place among the stars. The staff struck the floor, and the sound echoed like thunder. The council waited. Every eye turned toward the small figure standing in the silver circle at the center. The child stood still for a moment. The body was small compared to the towering aliens, the face young, but the eyes calm. The child looked around, not afraid of the countless stares, not afraid of the weight of 1,000 worlds pressing down. Then the child spoke. The voice was not loud, but it carried clear across the chamber. "You think humans are weak. You think we are violent, reckless, and dangerous. You are not wrong. We are all of those things. But that is not all we are." The council stirred. Some leaders hissed, others whispered. The High Chancellor narrowed his golden eyes. The child continued. "Humans make mistakes. We fight. We fail. But we rise again. Every time we fall, we learn. Every time we are broken, we grow stronger. That is our gift. Not perfect logic. Not perfect strength. Not perfect morality. Our gift is to never stop trying." The words spread through the hall. Some aliens nodded slightly, others frowned. The High Chancellor struck his staff once, warning the child to be careful. But the child did not stop. You tested me with puzzles. I solved them because I looked for the simple answers you missed. You tested me with beasts. I survived because I refused to let fear control me. You tested me with a cruel choice. I found another way because I refused to accept your rules. That is what humans do. We imagine. We create paths where no path exists. The council grew louder now, voices rising, some angry, some impressed. The High Chancellor shouted for silence, but his command was weaker than before. Too many were listening to the human child. The child raised their head and spoke louder, voice strong and steady. You fear us because we are young. You fear us because we grow faster than you expect. But you cannot ignore us. If one child can stand here and pass your trials, what will happen when all of humanity stands together? What will happen when we rise as one? The words echoed through the chamber. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Many leaders shifted uneasily. Others sat still, staring at the small human with new respect. One alien with shimmering wings stood and spoke. This child speaks truth. Humans are not weak. They are dangerous, but not only to us. They are dangerous to limits. They do not stop where others stop. They do not accept what others accept. Another alien with eyes of fire shouted back. Dangerous means threat. If we allow them power, they will spread across the stars like fire. The council erupted into chaos. Voices clashed, some demanding humanity be respected, others demanding humanity be contained. The High Chancellor struck his staff again and again, trying to control the storm. Finally, the sound of his voice broke through. Silence, he roared. The hall trembled. He pointed his staff at the child. You speak of courage and imagination. You speak of rising again and again. But words are easy. Why should we trust a species that still fights among itself? Why should we believe in humans when you have not yet mastered your own world? The hall fell quiet. It was a sharp question, one that cut deep. The child looked up at the High Chancellor, unshaken. Then the child answered. Because we are not finished. We are still growing. We are still learning. We are not perfect, and we may never be. But that is our strength. We will never stop reaching. We will never stop climbing. We will never stop trying to be better. Can you say the same about your people? The words hung in the air like fire. The council stirred again, but now more voices rose in support of the human child. The High Chancellor clenched his staff, his golden eyes burning, but he could not speak. He had no answer. For the first time, the Great Hall of the Galactic Council saw something they had never seen before. They saw not a weak species, not a reckless planet, but a future. A future that could not be stopped. The High Chancellor lowered his staff slowly. His silence was louder than thunder. The council knew the truth. The human child had won the battle of words. The trial was over. But the decision was not yet made. The council would have to vote. The child stood calm in the silver circle, small but unbroken, eyes bright, waiting for the final judgment.